Clara Anderson never imagined her life would take the turn it did. Growing up in a quiet town, her early years were ordinary, filled with school friends and the warmth of her parents' love. But all of that changed in an instant. The night her parents died in a tragic accident, Clara's world fell apart. Alone and grieving, she was thrust into a broken foster system where her days blurred into one another, each more uncertain than the last. It wasn't long before she caught the attention of the Syndicate, a shadowy organization that specialized in recruiting young, vulnerable individuals and turning them into something far more dangerous. Clara had potential, sharp reflexes, a keen mind, and an ability to adapt quickly. These qualities made her a prime candidate for their elite training program. Left with no family, no home, and no future, Clara accepted their offer, though she had no idea what she was truly getting into. From the moment she arrived at the Syndicate's training facility, Clara's life was no longer her own. The facility was hidden deep in the mountains, isolated from the world. The recruits, all teenagers like her, were stripped of their former identities and given new ones. Each was assigned a code name that symbolized who they would become. Clara was given the name NightShade, a beautiful but deadly flower, harmless to the eye but lethal to the touch. Her training was brutal. Long hours of physical conditioning, tactical exercises, and combat drills became her new reality. But it wasn't just about learning to fight. The Syndicate demanded more: complete obedience, emotional detachment, and unwavering loyalty. Her mentor, a cold and efficient operative known as Raven, was relentless. He taught her how to blend into any environment, how to disarm an opponent with a flick of her wrist, and how to keep her emotions buried deep beneath the surface. Yet even in the darkest of places, Clara found a glimmer of light. His name was Jake. Jake was another recruit, quick to smile and even quicker with his wit. Unlike most of the others, he hadn't yet lost his sense of humor or his humanity. At first, Clara resisted his attempts to befriend her, knowing that attachments could be dangerous. But over time, Jake's warmth began to melt the walls she had built around herself. Jake was 15 when they met, and she was 2 years younger. By the time she turned 18, they were closer than ever before. They trained together, sparring late into the night, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. But there was a rule in the Syndicate: no personal relationships. Attachments were seen as weaknesses, distractions that could lead to failure. Clara knew this, but she couldn't help the feelings that had developed for Jake. He was her anchor in a world that constantly tried to pull her under. One evening, after a grueling training session, Jake found her sitting alone, staring out at the vast, empty mountains. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Clara shrugged, but there was a tightness in her chest she couldn't shake. "I don't know if I can keep doing this." Jake sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "We'll get through this, together." She wanted to believe him. In that moment, with the sun setting and the world growing quiet, it felt like maybe, just maybe, there could be something beyond this life, something more than being a tool for the Syndicate. Months before graduation, Clara and Jake's bond continued to deepen as they endured some of the harshest trials the Syndicate could devise. The physical challenges became more brutal, the mental tests more punishing. Late nights spent training together turned into quiet moments of reflection. They spoke less of the future and more of surviving the present. Jake, always quick with a joke or a smile, began to show signs of wear. Clara noticed it first in his eyes. The same playful glint was still there, but behind it lurked exhaustion. And something more, something darker. They both knew what was coming. As the final months of their training loomed, they could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on them. Failure wasn't an option, and the price of weakness was elimination. One night, after a particularly brutal sparring session, Jake had turned to her, bruised and breathing heavily. "We'll get through this, together," he had said, his shoulder brushing hers. There was such conviction in his voice that Clara almost believed him. In that quiet moment, with the sun setting over the training grounds and the world falling silent, Clara dared to hope. Maybe, just maybe, there could be something beyond this life. Something more than being weapons for the syndicate. As the final tests approached, the syndicate upped the stakes. Clara and Jake were pitted against their peers in scenarios that mirrored real-world operations. The tests were designed to break them, to make them question everything, including each other. But no matter how intense the trials became, Clara and Jake's trust in one another only grew stronger. When it came down to the last assessment, they moved as one, an unbreakable unit. Their instructors watched in silence, recognizing that the two recruits had not only survived, but thrived. Graduation day came with little fanfare. It was not the celebratory affair most would imagine. There were no cheers, no applause, just a cold, formal ceremony in the underground halls of the syndicate's headquarters. Clara and Jake stood among the few who had made it through, their expressions stoic, masking the storm of emotions beneath. Their lives would never be the same. They had passed the final test and were no longer just trainees but fully fledged operatives. At the ceremony's conclusion, the syndicate's leaders handed them their assignments, the cold weight of responsibility settling onto their shoulders. There was no time to reflect on the path that had brought them there, no chance to say goodbye to their former selves. The future was now a series of missions, each more dangerous than the last. Their first mission together was in Budapest, where a group of hijackers had taken control of a high-speed train. Clara and Jake were dispatched to handle the situation with precision and discretion. As the train hurtled through the night, passengers unaware of the imminent danger, NightShade and Swift boarded undetected. Moving like shadows, they executed their tasks flawlessly, Clara dismantling the explosives that threatened to turn the train into a deadly projectile, while Jake, with his quick reflexes and expert aim, neutralized the hijackers one by one. By the time the train reached its destination, the passengers never knew they had been in mortal danger. NightShade and Swift had already disappeared into the night, their mission complete. It was the first of many assignments that would define their new lives. The Budapest mission was just the beginning. Over the following months, Clara and Jake completed numerous high-stakes operations together, becoming one of the syndicate's most effective duos. There was the time they were dispatched to infiltrate a cartel compound in Colombia, where Swift's quick thinking disarmed a perimeter of deadly traps, allowing Clara to slip in and extract the target before anyone knew they were there. Another mission took them to Tokyo, where they dismantled a notorious underground arms syndicate, their movements so precise that it seemed choreographed. Whether it was a daring rescue mission in the remote mountains of Kazakhstan or sabotaging a black market auction in Paris, the two operatives executed each mission flawlessly, their bond deepening with each success. Jake, true to his name, was swift in both body and mind. He was a master of improvisation, capable of adapting to any situation with effortless grace. Clara, ever the tactician, marveled at how quickly he could read a room, spot an opportunity, and exploit it before anyone else even realized something had changed. His presence was a constant source of calm and certainty for her. While Clara's approach was more methodical and calculated, Jake's spontaneity made them an unstoppable force in the field. Together they were the perfect balance, NightShade's deadly precision complemented by Swift's unpredictable agility. Off the field, things were more complicated. Despite the brutal efficiency that made them deadly in combat, Clara found it increasingly difficult to maintain the emotional detachment the syndicate demanded. The long nights spent together after missions, the quiet conversations in the rare moments of downtime, the way Jake could make her laugh, even in the darkest moments. All of it chipped away at the carefully constructed walls she had built around herself. Their connection went beyond camaraderie. It was something deeper, something neither of them could name but both felt intensely. They never discussed it openly. To admit to their growing attachment would have been a direct violation of syndicate rules. Attachments made operatives vulnerable, emotional ties were seen as weaknesses that could cloud judgment, and the syndicate had no room for weakness. Raven, their mentor and handler, was the embodiment of that philosophy. He was always watching, his sharp eyes never missing a thing. He had trained Clara to suppress her emotions, to bury her humanity for the sake of the mission, and though he never said anything outright, she could feel his growing displeasure. His cold, silent disapproval was palpable during their training sessions, a constant reminder that they were being watched. Still, Clara and Jake carried on, navigating the treacherous waters of their relationship while keeping it hidden from the syndicate. It was only in the small moments, away from the watchful eyes of their handlers, that Clara allowed herself to acknowledge the depth of what she felt for Jake. There was a night, after a mission in Berlin, where they had barely escaped a deadly ambush. They were holed up in a safe house, catching their breath after hours of tense combat. Clara's hands had been shaking as she reloaded her weapons, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Jake had sat down beside her, his arm brushing hers, and in that quiet, exhausted moment, he looked at her with such raw tenderness that it made her chest tighten. "You scared?" he had asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara had shaken her head, unable to put into words the complex mix of emotions swirling inside her. Fear wasn't the right word. It was something more, something deeper. "No," she had said after a pause. "Not scared, just tired." Jake had nodded, his hand brushing hers. "We'll get through this, you and me." And for a moment it felt true, as if they really could make it out of this life, leave the syndicate behind, and find something better. But deep down, Clara knew it was a dangerous fantasy. There was no leaving the syndicate. Operatives didn't retire, they either lived to serve or died in the field. As they sat together in the dimly lit safe house in Berlin, the tension of the recent ambush still lingering in the air, Clara allowed herself to relax for the first time in what felt like weeks. The weight of her gun pressed into her side as she leaned back against the worn couch, the adrenaline slowly draining from her body. Jake sat next to her, his arm resting on the back of the couch, his usually playful expressions subdued. In the stillness of that moment, after surviving another near-death experience, they allowed themselves to dream. It was something they rarely did. Talk about the future, about what might come after. Because deep down, both of them knew there wasn't supposed to be an after for people like them. The syndicate didn't leave loose ends, and anyone who tried to walk away was dealt with swiftly and without mercy. But that night, with the world outside their small, hidden sanctuary, feeling just a little farther away, Jake had looked at Clara, his eyes soft and full of an emotion she hadn't dared let herself feel for too long. He shifted slightly, turning to face her more directly, his usual teasing grin absent. "If we ever get out of here," Jake said, his voice quiet but filled with a strange kind of hope, "what would you do?" Clara blinked, caught off guard by the question. She hadn't thought about a life beyond the syndicate in years, not since her parents had died and she'd been sucked into this world of shadows and blood. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the impossibility of it all. She wanted to brush it off, to tell him they shouldn't be having this conversation. But when she looked at Jake, at his sincere, hopeful expression, she couldn't. "I don't know," she admitted softly, running her hand through her hair. But even as the words left her lips, something surfaced from deep within her, a memory from her old life before everything had gone dark. "Actually, I think I'd open a bakery." Jake raised an eyebrow, a surprised smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "A bakery?" he repeated, as if the idea of the cold, efficient NightShader running a quaint little bakery was absurd. Clara shrugged, her eyes distant as she let the thought take shape. "Yeah, I used to bake with my mum when I was a kid. Cookies, cakes, bread. She loved it. It was our thing." She paused, the bittersweet memory tugging at her heart. "I haven't done it in years, but I guess I miss it. The smell of fresh bread, the warmth of the oven. It was simple, peaceful. I'd love to do that again. Just make something with my hands that doesn't destroy things. Jake's smile widened, and, for a moment, Clara saw the boyish charm that had first drawn her to him. I can see it now, he said, leaning back and closing his eyes as if imagining it. Clara Anderson's famous bakery, the best pastries this side of wherever we end up. I'd be your first customer. Clara chuckled, shaking her head. I doubt you'd survive long on just pastries. Well, lucky for me, Jake replied, his eyes twinkling. I've got my own plan. Clara looked at him, intrigued. Oh? And what would that be? Jake stretched, his voice taking on a more playful tone. I'm going to buy a farm. A small one. Nothing fancy. Just a few acres of land somewhere quiet, maybe out in the country where no one can find us. I'll raise cattle, pigs, chickens. You know, real simple living. A farm, Clara repeated, trying to picture Jake, the sharp, quick-thinking operative she had fought beside for years, as a farmer. He nodded, his smile fading into something more sincere. Yeah, my grandparents had a farm when I was a kid. Spent a few summers there before everything went to hell. I loved it. The animals, the open fields, the quiet, it was peaceful. That's always been the dream, you know? To nurture life instead of... He trailed off, glancing down at the floor, his words heavy with meaning. Instead of always taking it. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She had never heard Jake talk like this before. For so long, they had only ever focused on survival, on the next mission, the next kill. Hearing him speak about life outside the syndicate, about raising animals and living off the land, made something stir deep inside her. She had almost forgotten that life could be something more than just surviving, that there could be joy, peace, even love. And what about you? Jake continued, his voice quieter now. You could bring your baked goods to the farmer's market, sell your famous pies and bread while I sell fresh eggs and milk. Clara laughed softly, though it was tinged with sadness. It sounds nice, but we both know it's a fantasy, Jake. There's no leaving the syndicate. He looked at her then, his eyes full of quiet determination. Maybe not now, but one day, Clara. One day we're going to get out of here. We'll find a way. She wanted to believe him. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to imagine that future. A small bakery, the smell of fresh bread filling the air, while Jake worked the fields of his farm, their lives intertwined in something simple and good. But the vision was fragile, and it shattered too easily against the harsh reality of their world. There was no escaping the syndicate. Operatives didn't retire. They were either loyal until death, or they were hunted down. Still that night, with Jake beside her, it felt almost possible. As if, for the first time in years, she could see a glimmer of hope at the end of the tunnel. But hope, she reminded herself, was dangerous. The missions kept coming, and Clara found herself relying on Jake more and more. He was her anchor in a world that constantly tried to pull her under. But their closeness didn't go unnoticed. The syndicate was always watching, always assessing. Raven's gaze grew colder, his orders more direct, as if he was testing Clara, pushing her to see how far she would go before breaking. Then came the mission that changed everything. It had started like any other. A routine infiltration to gather intel on a suspected arms dealer with ties to a terrorist network. Jake and Clara were assigned to the operation together, as usual. They had the details down to a science. Enter the target location, gather the intel, and get out. But something felt off to Clara from the start. The mission parameters seemed too simple, too clean. Jake had brushed off her concerns with his usual easygoing confidence, flashing her that grin that always managed to disarm her, even in the most stressful situations. "You're overthinking it, NightShade," he'd said, nudging her with his elbow as they geared up. "We've done this 100 times. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling. There was something Raven wasn't telling them, something lurking beneath the surface of the mission briefing. She had learned to trust her instincts, and they were screaming at her that something was wrong. Despite her reservations, they went in. The mission went smoothly at first. Too smoothly. They slipped into the target location, retrieved the data they needed, and were about to make their exit when everything went sideways. Alarms blared, and suddenly they were surrounded, trapped in a firefight that should never have happened. Jake's reflexes were as sharp as ever, and they fought their way through the chaos, but something in Clara's gut told her this was more than just a botched operation. When they finally made it back to the extraction point, bruised and battered but alive, Clara knew her suspicions had been correct. The debrief was short. Too short. Raven had been unusually distant, his eyes betraying nothing as he listened to their report. There were no questions, no comments, just a cold "well done" before they were dismissed. Clara's unease only grew in the days that followed. Jake, ever the optimist, tried to shrug it off, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Raven's gaze followed her more closely than ever, and the atmosphere within the syndicate had grown tense, like the calm before a storm. Then, one day, everything changed. Jake was sent on a routine mission. A solo operation, Raven had said. Simple, straightforward. But Clara's gut twisted with dread the moment she heard the assignment. It wasn't like Jake to be sent out alone. They always worked as a team. Something was wrong. She had begged Raven for more information, but he had been as inscrutable as ever, simply telling her that Swift was more than capable of handling it. But Jake never returned. His body was never found. The official report claimed he had been caught in crossfire, an unfortunate casualty in a dangerous world. But Clara knew better. She had seen too many patterns, too many signs. Jake's death was no accident. It was orchestrated. The syndicate had decided that he was a liability, and they had eliminated him as they would any other threat. Grief struck Clara like a tidal wave, threatening to consume her, but instead of drowning, she let the pain harden her resolve. She embraced the name NightShade, fully becoming the lethal force the syndicate had trained her to be. She buried her emotions, her warmth, and her humanity beneath layers of cold calculation. Every mission became an outlet for her anger, every success a reminder of what had been taken from her. Her reputation grew. NightShade became known for her efficiency, her precision, and her ability to complete any mission without a trace. She was everything the syndicate wanted: obedient, deadly, and unfeeling. But beneath the surface, Clara never forgot. She never forgot Jake's smile, his laughter, or the way he had believed in something better. She never forgot the betrayal that had shattered her trust in the syndicate. And though she played the part of their perfect assassin, she began to plot her own path, waiting for the moment when she could take down the organization that had taken everything from her. Clara knew one thing: they had made her into NightShade, but one day she would be the poison that destroyed them. The seeds of rebellion had been planted. The syndicate thought they had created the perfect assassin, but what they didn't realize was that Clara Anderson was more than just a weapon. She was a survivor, and one day she would ensure that the syndicate paid for what they had done. Until then, she would wait, she would bide her time, and when the